Hey everyone, this is Andrew Town. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I have the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip, and this is the base model of the laptop. And today I'm going to show you how good this machine is at emulating retro games. So today I'm going to be emulating a whole load of different systems, including the PlayStation, PlayStation 2, GameCube, Wii, Xbox, Sega Saturn, 3DS, the original Xbox, etc. So I'm going to cover all sorts of emulation systems, and I'm going to be showing off the performance of this machine. So all the emulators I want to talk about have video tutorials which I've made on my second channel. So every single system that I'm going to talk about today is going to have a corresponding video tutorial link. Please check out the links in the description for every single video tutorial. So the first piece of software I'm going to show you is called OpenEmu. This is a multiple video game system emulator front end. If you look at the left hand side of the screen, we have all sorts of systems that we can emulate on the M1 Pro chip, including the NES, the Neo Geo Pocket. Today we're going to be looking at Sega Saturn emulation, and I'm going to be running Sega Rally Championship. So this is a very easy emulator to use. All you have to do is to drag and drop the ROMs into the system and it automatically picks up the title and the artwork for you. So here I'm just going to resume my game just by double clicking on it, and it's already picked up my save state. Here I'm going to click resume and the game has already loaded up. I'm going to be using my Xbox One wireless controller, which I've connected up via Bluetooth here. And all we need to do is to full screen this, and then I can see the entire screen. So here it's picked up all of my controls automatically. So it's mapped everything to the Xbox One wireless controller, and it seems to be running perfectly fine. It's running at full speed. There are no graphical hitches, and this is running perfectly well. So Sega Saturn emulation is definitely possible on this system. So for all of the Pokemon fans out there, you'll be happy to know that Game Boy Advance games run perfectly well. Here I'm just going to resume a game I was playing earlier. So I know that Game Boy Advance games aren't particularly hard to emulate, but this is a really cool user interface for playing these types of games. You can easily do things like save states and resume states, and also apply things like shaders. So I can do things like add a CRT shader, so it looks like we're playing on an old CRT screen. And it's also really easy to remap controls too. So it has this really nice interface where you can go ahead and go into each individual emulator system, and you can click on a button. You can map it to a specific controller button or a keyboard key. So next I'm going to look at PSP emulation. So here I've got God of War Ghost of Sparta. So I'm going to double click on this just to show you how this works. So the thing about the PSP core within OpenEmu is that we don't actually have the ability to scale or do any of the kind of fancy graphics settings. So we're stuck on the native resolution of this. So this is just a limitation of OpenEmu. And what we can do instead is that we can actually switch to the PPSSPP full ARM build. So the thing about OpenEmu is that firstly, it's a front end of emulators. So not all of the emulator cores are going to be the most up to date. Secondly, it is also an Intel application. So it's running through the Rosetta 2 translation layer, which is going to make some of the CPU operations a little bit slower. Therefore, if we run PSP games through this, then we're not going to get the full benefits of the machine. So for example, if you really want to play PSP games, then I do recommend that you check out my PPSSPP native ARM build tutorial. So this will show you how to build the emulator natively for the M1 Pro chip, and you'll get much better access to all of the graphical settings as well as increased performance as well. So I'm going to show you PPSSPP in action. I'm actually going to load up God of War Ghost of Sparta again, and this time I'm going to go to settings, and we're going to be using the Vulkan backend. So presumably this is going to be using Molten VK in order to render on the Metal Graphics API. We're also going to be selecting a 4x PSP resolution. So this is going to be much closer to the native resolution of this screen. And basically this game is running at a solid 60 frames per second, despite the fact that we are running at 4x the resolution of the internal display, and it's looking much nicer than OpenEmu. So here we're going to be running a different game, Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition, and I'm going to demonstrate how fast this runs too. So again, we are running this at 4x the resolution. So Midnight Dub 3 is capped at 30 frames per second, and this is pretty much as fast as it goes. However, we are running this at a 4x internal resolution. It plays fantastically well on the M1 Pro. So next emulator I'm going to be demonstrating is the GameCube Wii emulator called Dolphin. And Dolphin has actually been updated to work on native ARM. So it means that we're going to get the best performance out of this. It's probably the best emulator that works on the M1 Mac. So here we're going to demonstrate Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, which is quite notorious for being difficult to emulate on any system. So in terms of graphics, I'm going to be running this game at 4x native resolution. So this is aiming at 1440p. We are using the Vulkan backend, which is presumably using Molten VK in order to translate this to Metal. And we have the adapter, which is detected as the Apple M1 Pro right here. So this game is being rendered at 1440p, and we're mostly at a solid 50 to 60 frames per second, which is quite impressive considering that this game is quite notoriously difficult to emulate on any system. So this M1 Pro is doing a very good job of playing this particular game. Now I'm going to try a different game. Let's open up The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. So here we're playing a game that's capped at 30 frames per second, and we're running this at 1440p. I think I'd actually increase the resolution even higher if I wanted to. However, this game seems to be running quite smoothly at this frame rate and at this resolution as well. So I definitely feel this is very responsive and it's working perfectly well on this system. So here we're going to be running the game Sonic Colors, and what I've done is I've applied the 60 frame per second code. I'm going to be running this game at the 6 times native resolution, which is 4K, which is actually slightly higher than the native resolution of this screen. So this game is hitting 60 frames per second, even though we're running this game at a 4K resolution. And even though this game was never designed to run at over 30 frames per second, it's actually handling this beautifully. So here we're loading up Tatsunoko versus Capcom. This is the fighting game which I'm going to be using my controller for. So again, we're running this at 6 times the native resolution at 4K, and we're just going to have a go and play on these characters. So I don't really know how to play this game, but we're definitely getting a solid 60 frames per second, even though we're running this at a 4K resolution again. And it feels very responsive and the graphics look very good. I'm not really an expert at this game, as you can tell, but I've heard that this is a difficult game to emulate. What I'd like to show you next is the macOS build for PCSX2. So this is a fork of the very popular PlayStation 2 emulator that's most commonly played on Windows. And if you're interested in running this on your Mac, you can try out my PCSX2 tutorial, which I'll leave a link to in the description. So this is mainly the work of a single contributor called Tello Crinkle, and what they've been doing is tirelessly updating PCSX2 so that it'll work on the Mac operating system. So today I'm going to show you some Tekken 5 gameplay. Now the performance and the state of PlayStation 2 emulation on the Mac is not really great. We are actually forced to use the software renderer in order to achieve compatibility and speed with most games. If we do use the OpenGL renderer, this is based on a really old version of OpenGL and it's extremely slow, even on the M1 Pro chip. If we use OpenGL rendering, then we get access to a lot of the fixes and widescreen hacks and also the increases in resolution. However, it does run extremely slowly. So if you look at this frame rate, we're only running at 72% speed at about 40 frames per second. However, if we switch this back to the software rendering, we're getting full speed at 60 frames per second. So you can see the frame rate at the top of the screen, and it's not particularly impressive because we are running at the internal PlayStation 2 resolution, which is not very high, and it doesn't look particularly good, and it doesn't have any of the widescreen fixes that we're very used to. However, it is completely playable. While I tried PlayStation 2 emulation in the past on the original M1 chip, this didn't run very well at all. This has come a huge way from earlier in 2021, so I do hope that progress continues and we get more and more playable games on the macOS port of the PCSX2 emulator. So the next emulator I'm going to be using is Redream. So this is the Dreamcast emulator, and I'm going to be running the game Crazy Taxi. So here we're just going to double click on the Crazy Taxi ROM. So I'm going to be running this game at the highest resolution at 3024 by 1964, and we're going to be using the exclusive full screen mode. So here we're running the game Crazy Taxi, and it's close to a 4K resolution, and it's running beautifully at 60 frames per second. It's really quite impressive how smooth this gameplay is because it's upscaled to such a high degree. So here we're running the game at 60 frames per second, even though we're upscaled at close to a 4K resolution. So this is looking very nice and very smooth. As you might be able to tell, I'm not very good at this game. So now we're going to try Marvel vs. Capcom 2, the classic fighting game. So here we're upscaled to close to a 4K resolution. It's running at 60 frames per second and it's working very nicely. So this is very playable. I've also just noticed that we have a notch at the top of the screen. So if you actually want to get rid of that, all you have to do is select a resolution that's slightly lower. The vertical resolution here of 1964, if we remove the 74 pixels there, then we're going to get a resolution that doesn't have the notch. Just make sure that when you select an exclusive full screen resolution, just make sure it's one that's 16 by 10 or 16 by 9. So the next emulator I'm going to show you is Citra. So this is for 3DS emulation, and today I'm going to be running Majora's Mask. So I have a tutorial on how to download the native version of the software. Please check out the link in the description for this video. So I'm going to be running this game at 9 times native resolution, so this is very close to 4K resolution. So here we can see the frame rate at the bottom of the bar, and we're running here at a solid 30 frames per second, even though we're upscaled at such a high resolution, and it seems to be very responsive. It feels very nice. This game is optimized for the M1 ARM chip, and it runs perfectly well on this system. So if you ever wanted to play Majora's Mask at 4K, then this is definitely the way to do it. However, this game is definitely still a work in progress, so when I try to run a game like Pokemon X, and I can actually get into the menu just fine. If I resize the window, I can see the game just fine. However, when I select a language and actually try to start the game, then it will actually crash. So there's definitely still some more development work left for this emulator. So the next emulator I'm going to try is Duckstation. So this is the kind of specialized PlayStation 1 emulator. So again, this is an Intel emulator that's running through Rosetta 2. So it's not necessarily the most optimized. However, it does run nicely on the M1 Pro. Of course, you could choose to use OpenEmu to run PlayStation 1 games instead. It's really up to you. So I'm going to run this at 9 times the internal resolution for 4K display. play. So Tekken 3 works great, it's running at 60 frames per second at 4K resolution. So this is definitely one of my favorite games and it runs perfectly well on the M1 Pro. So the last emulator I'm going to show you today is Xemu or Xemu, and this is running as a native ARM build of the software. If you want to check out how to do this, please check out the link in the description. So here we're showing the game Halo Combat Evolved. Now this is a game that's actually compatible with crossover or parallels on the M1 Pro. And this is not exactly the best game to showcase the Xemu emulator as it's not fully optimized or compatible. However, we are getting a decentish frame rate of 27, 28 FPS. And this is quite good considering that Xbox emulation was never really taken very seriously, and it's only very recently that this was actually ported to the M1 Apple Silicon Mac because there's quite a lot of difficulty actually emulating the original Xbox architecture. So here we're not getting fantastic frame rates around 15-16 FPS. The cutscenes are slightly better, but when we're actually in actual interactive gameplay, it's not fantastic. So this is just the setup menu here, so I can't imagine what it'll be like in an actual game. If you did actually want to play this game on the M1 Apple Silicon Mac, then please check out my Parallels tutorial, which will show you how to get the Halo Master Chief Collection working on the M1 Apple Silicon Mac. So to be fair, the game Halo Combat Evolved is only listed as a playable game. It's not a perfectly playable game. Here we're going to try GoldenEye Rogue Agent and see how this runs on Xemu. So here we're getting around 20 to 30 FPS running this Xbox emulator. The performance of this is okay. However, if you have a cross-platform game that actually runs on GameCube or Wii, then that's going to run much better than on the actual Xbox itself. That's because this emulator still has a long way to go in terms of compatibility and performance, but it's nice to know that it can work and that it could possibly work better in the future once the emulator itself becomes more mature. So all of these systems that I've tested out today have corresponding video tutorials, so please check out these video tutorials if you want to get any of these games running on the system. So you might notice that we haven't covered some key emulators. So for example, we don't have a PlayStation 3 emulator and we don't have a Switch emulator. So unfortunately, the development of these emulators have stalled. This is due to macOS not supporting the Vulkan backend without a compatibility layer like Molten VK. So unfortunately, it looks like we're not going to be able to get compatibility for those emulators or systems in the near future. So it really depends on whether there's going to be any interest in someone picking up the PlayStation 3 emulators and then porting them to the Mac operating system, and same goes for Switch as well. We'll see in the future if anyone does this. If there are any developments on the situation for PS3 or Switch, I'll be sure to make a video about it in the future. So I definitely say that the M1 Pro is a fantastic little retro gaming system. However, I would never suggest that somebody goes out and buys an M1 Pro just to be able to emulate games, but it's nice to know that you do have quite a large selection that is well optimized for the M1 Apple Silicon Mac. And if you're using this as a work machine and you wanted to do some light retro gaming, then the software and the hardware is definitely able for you to do that. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.